to say this plainly before anyone settles into their seat. When John Kennedy leans into that folksy cadence and asks a question that sounds almost gentle, it can do more damage than a shouted accusation. And when Adam Schiff speaks with unwavering moral certainty, it can feel less like persuasion and more like a verdict delivered before the defense has finished its first sentence. Why open this hard? And why point the spotlight at both men at the same time? Because if you stay with this story to the end, you'll see that the real conflict here is not ideology alone, but control over what the audience is allowed to feel certain about. So before you decide who you're rooting for, watch how certainty and doubt are manufactured, shaped, and weaponized in public. The reason this exchange hits so hard only becomes clear when you notice the trap forming, not when it finally snaps shut. Now let's slow this down, because the opening always matters more than the punchline, and most viewers miss that while they wait for the clip. This is a dramatized political analysis, not a courtroom judgment, and that distinction matters because political media today thrives on blurring lines until outrage feels indistinguishable from proof. The audience is not simply watching a debate. It is being trained to associate tone with truth and confidence with credibility. Once that association is set, the facts themselves become secondary, because the emotional frame has already done the heavy lifting. That is the environment in which John Kennedy and Adam Schiff step into the same room, fully aware of the cameras, and even more aware of the audience beyond them. Adam Schiff enters these moments carrying the weight of institutional authority, and he knows exactly how that weight reads on television. His voice is measured, his language careful, his posture signaling that he is not merely speaking for himself, but for norms, processes, and the idea of responsible governance. To many viewers, that seriousness feels reassuring, like an adult presence in a chaotic political landscape that seems permanently on the brink. But seriousness can also harden into something else when it leaves no space for uncertainty, because certainty delivered from on high can sound like instruction rather than explanation. And when that happens, persuasion quietly gives way to expectation, the expectation that the audience should already agree. John Kennedy understands that instinctively, which is why his approach is the mirror image. He does not present himself as the guardian of the institution, but as the curious skeptic standing just outside the velvet rope. His questions are framed as common sense, almost conversational. The kind of questions a viewer might imagine asking if they were allowed a microphone. That style flatters the audience because it invites them into the role of judge rather than student. And when the audience feels like the judge, even a partial answer can feel like an evasion. The clash between these two styles is not accidental, and it is not spontaneous. Schiff's power lies in framing issues as already settled by evidence and process, leaving dissent to sound like irresponsibility. Kennedy's power lies in framing those same issues as open to basic inquiry, leaving authority to sound like deflection. Neither man is naive about what they are doing, and neither is improvising in the moment. They are performing roles that have been refined through years of hearings, interviews, and viral aftermaths. What makes this exchange compelling is that both strategies work, but they work on different emotional instincts. Schiff appeals to the instinct to trust institutions when things feel unstable, because institutions promise continuity and rules. Kennedy appeals to the instinct to distrust institutions when they feel distant, because skepticism promises independence and self-respect. The audience does not choose between policy positions first. It chooses between those instincts. Only afterward does it backfill reasons to justify the emotional choice it has already made. This is where my own view comes in, and I'm not going to pretend I don't have one. Adam Schiff is often persuasive, because he sounds prepared, disciplined, and anchored in process. But when he leans too hard on certainty, he risks sounding like he wants compliance rather than understanding. John Kennedy is often effective because he sounds relatable and unscripted, but when he leans too hard on rhetorical traps, he risks turning oversight into a game where winning matters more than clarity. Both men are skilled, and both men benefit from a system that rewards moments over outcomes. The danger is not that either style exists, but that the audience is encouraged to consume the style as a substitute for substance. The room itself plays a role in this performance, even if viewers barely notice it. The formal setting, the raised dais, the microphones, the nameplates, all signal seriousness before anyone speaks. Schiff fits naturally into that environment because his manner reinforces the gravity the room already projects. Kennedy disrupts it just enough to suggest that gravity might be hiding something, which is often all it takes to seed doubt. Once doubt enters the frame, every pause and every measured answer starts to feel heavier than it actually is. And yes, there is an element of dark humor in watching this unfold, because Washington has perfected a kind of solemn theater. Everyone insists the stakes are grave, while simultaneously angling for the clip that will dominate the next news cycle. Staffers sit frozen, knowing that a single sentence can undo months of preparation, and that silence can be just as loud as speech. You can almost sense the internal calculations happening in real time, the awareness that this is no longer about the hearing, but about the narrative. That tension, half civic ritual and half media spectacle, is what keeps audiences watching, even when they claim to be exhausted by politics. As Schiff speaks, he often sounds like he is closing an argument rather than opening one. That can project confidence, but it can also leave viewers feeling like the conversation has already moved past them. As Kennedy listens, he often looks like he is waiting for a crack, not because he lacks respect for the process, but because he knows cracks are what travel farthest online. When he finally speaks, the question is rarely long, and it rarely needs to be. The simplicity is the point, because simplicity invites projection. This is where the exchange begins to turn from policy into perception. Schiff is trying to protect the authority of conclusions, while Kennedy is trying to challenge the authority of the process that produced them. One wants the audience to trust that the work has been done. The other wants the audience to wonder whether the work was done fairly. Both appeals are emotionally potent, and neither requires lying to be effective. They only require selective emphasis, which is the most powerful tool in modern political communication. So when viewers ask why this moment felt so charged, the answer is not that one man destroyed the other. The answer is that the audience could feel itself being pulled in two directions at once, toward certainty and toward doubt. That tension is uncomfortable, but it is also addictive, because it makes people feel like something important is happening. And in an era where attention is scarce, making people feel that importance is half the battle. What happens next only escalates that tension, because once the frame is set, every word becomes a test of loyalty rather than a search for truth. Once the frame is set, the room stops behaving like a place where information is exchanged and starts behaving like a place where authority is tested. Adam Schiff knows this instinctively, which is why he tightens his language the moment he senses that a question is not really a question, but an invitation to doubt. He leans into precision, into carefully structured sentences that sound like they have already survived internal review, because structure itself communicates legitimacy. Every clause is measured, every pause intentional, as if the very rhythm of his speech is meant to signal that nothing here is accidental. To supporters, this sounds like discipline. To skeptics, It can sound like insulation. John Kennedy, on the other hand, thrives in the space between words, in the gaps where certainty feels slightly too polished. He listens not just for what Schiff says, but for how long it takes him to say it. Because hesitation is often more persuasive than contradiction. Kennedy's posture is relaxed, almost deferential, which makes his interruptions feel less like attacks and more like reasonable clarifications. That contrast is not accidental, because a relaxed tone makes the other person's seriousness feel heavier, almost defensive by comparison. The audience reads that contrast before it reads any transcript. What makes this dynamic so effective is that both men are exploiting a psychological shortcut the public relies on without realizing it. People tend to trust speakers who sound like they are not trying to win, even when those speakers are very much trying to win. Kennedy's questions feel exploratory, which allows him to advance an implication without owning it outright. Schiff's answers feel conclusive, which allows critics to suggest he is closing the door too quickly. Neither approach requires deception, only a careful choice of tone. This is where the exchange starts to drift away from substance and toward symbolism. Schiff is no longer just defending a position, he is defending the idea that institutions still deserve deference. Kennedy is no longer just questioning a claim, he is questioning whether that deference has been earned. Those are existential questions in American politics because they tap into a deep divide about trust itself. Once trust becomes the issue, facts become ammunition rather than foundations. The audience feels this shift even if it cannot articulate it. Viewers who already distrust institutions hear Schiff and think they are being lectured. Viewers who already fear institutional collapse hear Kennedy and think irresponsibility is being rewarded. Each side hears confirmation of what it already suspects, which is why neither side feels persuaded by the other. The exchange becomes a mirror rather than a bridge. There is also an unspoken contest over who gets to sound like they are speaking for the people. Schiff speaks in the plural, referencing responsibilities, obligations, and collective standards, which implies representation. Kennedy speaks in the singular, asking what I don't understand, or what people back home ask me, which implies authenticity. Representation and authenticity are not the same thing, but they compete for the same emotional real estate. Whichever one the audience values more in that moment will feel like the truth. At this stage, humor begins to creep in, not because anyone is trying to be funny, but because tension creates absurdity. Someone will inevitably say something like, "Let me finish," while clearly trying to finish before the next interruption lands. Someone else will thank the other for their passion, which is Washington's polite way of acknowledging hostility without naming it. These moments become memes because they expose the artificial politeness layered over genuine conflict. The public laughs not out of joy, but out of recognition. Schiff's challenge is that once he sounds annoyed, even slightly, the narrative shifts. Annoyance from authority can look like impatience with accountability, even when it is simply frustration with bad faith. Kennedy's challenge is that once his questioning sounds too clever, the narrative shifts again. Cleverness can look like manipulation, even when it is simply effective communication. Both men walk a narrow line, and both know the cost of slipping. The media environment amplifies every misstep. Clips are cut before explanations finish, pauses are framed as silence, and raised eyebrows are treated like admissions. Schiff understands this, which is why he often tries to preemptively close loops, leaving less room for misinterpretation. Kennedy understands this too, which is why he opens loops and lets the audience fill them in. Open loops are more dangerous, but but they are also more shareable. This is where the public's role becomes uncomfortable to acknowledge. The audience is not just consuming this exchange, it is rewarding certain behaviors with attention. Every viral clip teaches politicians what works, and what works is rarely nuance. When viewers reward the sharpest question or the most indignant response, they are shaping the next hearing before it happens. In that sense, the audience is a silent participant at the table. There are serious implications to this pattern. If hearings become stages for narrative dominance rather than tools for oversight, policy suffers quietly in the background. Complex issues get flattened into moral binaries because binaries are easier to market. Schiff's expertise risks being reduced to a tone, and Kennedy's skepticism risks being reduced to a punchline. Both outcomes weaken the public's ability to evaluate what actually matters. The most revealing moments are often the smallest ones. A half-second pause before answering a question. A glance at the clock that suggests awareness of airtime rather than substance. A carefully neutral phrase that avoids saying yes or no because either answer would travel poorly. These micro-moments tell the real story of modern political communication. As the exchange continues, the emotional stakes rise even if the policy stakes remain unchanged. Schiff becomes increasingly focused on maintaining the seriousness of the proceeding, because losing that seriousness would mean losing moral ground. Kennedy becomes increasingly focused on puncturing that seriousness, because puncturing it reframes the entire encounter. Neither man is likely to change the other's mind, and neither expects to. They are speaking past each other to the same audience, each hoping to capture a different instinct. The irony is that both instincts are valid in isolation. Institutions do need defenders who understand their complexity. Institutions also need critics who question their behavior. The problem arises when defense turns into dismissal, and critique turns into spectacle. That is the tension playing out in real time, and it is why this exchange feels heavier than it looks on paper. As a viewer, the uncomfortable task is resisting the urge to treat this like a sporting event. It is tempting to declare a winner based on who landed the cleanest line or drew the biggest reaction. But governance does not operate on applause, even if politics increasingly does. If the takeaway is only that one man owned the other, then the deeper lesson has been missed. The real lesson is how easily attention can be redirected away from outcomes and toward personalities. By the end of this phase of the exchange, the ground has already shifted. The conversation is no longer about the original issue that brought them into the room. It is about who appears trustworthy under pressure. That perception will follow both men long after the microphones are turned off. And it sets the stage for what comes next, when the tension moves from implication to outright confrontation. By the time the exchange reaches its midpoint, the air in the room changes in a way that seasoned observers recognize instantly, because this is the moment when performance begins to outweigh preparation. Adam Schiff senses that the questioning is no longer merely probing the edges of his argument, but quietly inviting the audience to doubt the frame itself. That realization forces a subtle recalibration, not in policy substance, but in emotional posture. Because sounding too rigid risks alienation, while sounding too flexible risks appearing evasive. His responses become slightly longer, not because the questions demand it, but because length itself can feel like control when uncertainty is creeping in. To an attentive viewer, this is where confidence starts to feel rehearsed rather than instinctive. John Kennedy notices the shift immediately, because his entire approach depends on detecting when an opponent begins to manage optics instead of ideas. He does not interrupt more often, but he times his interruptions more carefully. landing them at moments when Schiff appears to be building momentum. This has the effect of breaking rhythm, and rhythm matters more than logic in live political exchanges. Once rhythm is broken, even strong answers can feel defensive simply because they arrive after friction. Kennedy does not rush this process because impatience would undermine the illusion of curiosity he is cultivating. What's happening beneath the surface is a battle over emotional authority. Schiff's authority comes from institutional memory, from sounding like someone who has seen the classified briefings and understands their gravity. Kennedy's authority comes from sounding like someone who refuses to be impressed by gravity alone. Neither form of authority is inherently illegitimate, but they collide in a way that forces the audience to choose which one feels more honest. That choice is rarely rational, even when viewers believe it is. This is also the point where language starts doing more work than facts. Schiff uses words like framework, process, and precedent, which anchor his argument in continuity. Kennedy responds with words like common sense, regular folks, and simple question, which anchor his challenge in accessibility. The contrast is striking because both are speaking English, yet they are clearly addressing different versions of the same audience. One speaks to institutional trust, the other to experiential skepticism. The humor that surfaces here is sharper than before because it now carries intent. A mild chuckle from Kennedy after a long answer can read as dismissal without ever sounding disrespectful. A tight smile from Schiff after a pointed question can read as condescension without ever becoming explicit. These are not accidents. They are signals. In modern political media, signals often matter more than statements. The audience's reaction becomes increasingly polarized, even if the room itself remains outwardly controlled. Supporters of Schiff hear patience being tested by bad faith questioning. Supporters of Kennedy hear evasiveness being exposed by persistence. What both sides are actually responding to is not new information, but reinforcement of existing narratives. The exchange functions less like a debate and more like a sorting mechanism. This is where many viewers begin asking themselves a quiet question they may not articulate out loud. Why does this feel more intense than the policy issue itself? The answer is uncomfortable, because it suggests that politics has become a proxy for deeper anxieties about power and accountability. Schiff represents continuity in a system that many people feel has stopped listening. Kennedy represents disruption in a system that many people fear could be dismantled irresponsibly. As the pressure builds, Schiff attempts to reclaim narrative ground by reframing the stakes. He emphasizes consequences, reminding the room that decisions discussed here affect real-world security and real-world lives. This is not manipulative in itself, but it does raise the emotional temperature. Kennedy responds not by disputing the importance of those consequences, but by questioning whether the system producing them is functioning as advertised. The disagreement shifts from "what should we do" to "who should we trust?" There is a brief moment, often missed in clipped highlights, where Schiff almost appears to invite a different kind of conversation. He softens slightly, acknowledging public skepticism and conceding that institutions have made mistakes. For a split second, the exchange could pivot toward genuine dialogue. But the moment passes quickly because vulnerability is risky in a room designed for scoring points. Kennedy presses forward, and the opening closes. This missed pivot is revealing because it shows how constrained modern political debate has become. The format rewards clarity over complexity and confidence over curiosity. Any pause long enough to think risks being interpreted as weakness. Any concession risks being weaponized later in a clip or headline. As a result, both men default back to safer ground. Kennedy's questions become slightly more pointed now, though still framed as requests for clarification. He repeats earlier phrases, not because they were unanswered, but because repetition can create the impression of avoidance. Schiff notices this and begins to reference previous answers, which ironically reinforces the sense of circularity. To an audience already primed for suspicion, circularity feels like obfuscation. The substance may be solid, but the optics are slipping. This is also where external context starts to matter more than the exchange itself. Viewers bring with them prior impressions of Schiff as a symbol of establishment power. They bring with them prior impressions of Kennedy as a populist skeptic. The exchange becomes a canvas onto which those impressions are projected. What is said matters less than who is perceived to be saying it. Politics turns psychological. From a strategic standpoint, both men are achieving something, even if neither is winning outright. Schiff is reinforcing his image as a guardian of process, someone who takes the machinery of governance seriously. Kennedy is reinforcing his image as a questioner, someone unwilling to accept authority without explanation. These images will be replayed far beyond this room, detached from their original context. That replayability is the real currency of modern hearings. The cost of this dynamic is subtle but significant. When oversight becomes theater, genuine accountability becomes harder to sustain. Officials learn to speak in ways that minimize risk rather than maximize clarity. Critics learn to ask questions that generate reactions rather than answers. The audience learns to evaluate politics like entertainment, even when it insists otherwise. As this phase of the exchange winds down, there is a sense that something unresolved is hanging in the air. No decisive contradiction has occurred. No clear admission has been extracted. Yet the emotional ledger has shifted, and both sides know it. Schiff looks more burdened, Kennedy more energized. That contrast alone will shape headlines. The important thing to recognize is that this shift did not require anyone to lie. It required only the careful use of tone, timing, and expectation. That is what makes it so powerful and so difficult to counter. Truth can survive this environment, but it rarely dominates it. What dominates instead is the feeling of having witnessed something consequential. As the exchange moves toward its next stage, the audience is no longer asking what the policy outcome will be. They are asking who they trust to tell them the truth in a system they increasingly doubt. That question lingers longer than any specific answer given in the room, and it sets the conditions for the escalation that follows, when implication hardens into accusation and restraint becomes harder to maintain. At this point in the exchange, restraint becomes a liability rather than a virtue, and both men sense it, even if neither says it aloud. The longer the conversation continues without a clear rupture, the more the audience begins to project its own conclusions onto the silence. What was once curiosity hardens into suspicion, and suspicion demands escalation. This is the moment when tone alone is no longer enough to carry authority. Something sharper is expected, even if it costs everyone involved. Adam Schiff responds by narrowing his answers, not because he lacks material, but because precision now feels safer than breadth. He trims away context and focuses on definitive statements, hoping clarity will reassert control. In another environment, this would read as professionalism. Here it risks sounding like finality imposed too early. Finality without consensus often feels like avoidance, even when it is not. John Kennedy senses the compression immediately. Shorter answers give him less surface area to explore, but they also give him clearer edges to press against. He shifts from exploratory questions to comparative ones, asking why one standard applies here but not there. Why caution is invoked now but dismissed elsewhere. These questions are effective because they don't accuse, they juxtapose. Juxtaposition lets the audience accuse on his behalf. The exchange begins to resemble a cross-examination, though no one acknowledges it as such. Schiff resists the framing by reiterating roles and responsibilities, reminding the room that oversight is not a game of hypotheticals. Kennedy resists that resistance by continuing to frame his questions as common sense. Each man is trying to pull the conversation into terrain where his instincts dominate. Neither terrain is neutral. This is also where the emotional asymmetry becomes more pronounced. Schiff sounds increasingly burdened by the implications of what he is discussing, and that weight shows. Kennedy sounds increasingly unburdened, almost conversational, as if the stakes are theoretical rather than real. To some viewers, Schiff's gravity signals seriousness. To others, Kennedy's ease signals confidence. The divide deepens. A subtle shift occurs in how interruptions are received. Earlier, interruptions felt procedural, even expected. Now, each interruption lands with more force because it disrupts an already compressed answer. Schiff begins to signal irritation more clearly, though still within the bounds of decorum. Kennedy continues to interrupt with courtesy intact, which paradoxically amplifies the disruption. Politeness becomes a sharper tool than aggression. The room itself reacts in small ways. Chairs shift, aides exchange glances. A few observers lean forward as if anticipating a break. These physical cues are rarely captured in clips, but they shape the energy of the exchange. Everyone senses that the conversation is approaching a point of no return. Whether that point is revelation or rupture remains unclear. From a viewer's perspective, this is where questions start forming that go beyond the immediate topic. Why does one man seem so certain that the process must be defended, while the other seems so certain that it must be questioned? Why does institutional language feel reassuring to some and alienating to others? Why does skepticism feel empowering to some and reckless to others? These questions linger because the exchange refuses to resolve them. Schiff attempts to regain narrative initiative by referencing outcomes rather than intentions. He emphasizes what has been prevented, what has been mitigated, what has not gone wrong. This is a rational move, but rationality is not always persuasive under pressure. Prevented outcomes are invisible by nature, and invisible successes are hard to celebrate. Kennedy exploits that invisibility by asking what might have been overlooked instead. The dynamic now resembles two parallel monologues colliding rather than a dialogue progressing. Each man hears the other, but neither is adjusting course meaningfully. They are speaking to the audience through each other, not with each other. That distinction matters because it reveals the real target of the exchange. The room is incidental, the cameras are central. Humor reappears briefly, sharper and more brittle than before. A dry remark from Kennedy draws a ripple of reaction. A restrained response from Schiff draws a different kind of reaction. Neither moment advances understanding, but both advance narrative. Narrative, in this context, is power. There is a growing sense that the exchange is no longer about resolving anything. It is about establishing a record, not for historians, but for viewers. Schiff wants the record to show diligence, seriousness, and adherence to norms. Kennedy wants the record to show skepticism, persistence, and refusal to defer automatically. Both records will be clipped, shared, and argued over independently of their original context. The risk for Schiff is that seriousness can curdle into perceived arrogance if the audience feels talked down to. The risk for Kennedy is that skepticism can curdle into perceived cynicism if the audience feels manipulated. Neither risk is theoretical. Both have played out countless times before. The men are not just navigating the exchange, but their own reputations. That self-awareness adds another layer of tension. As this phase draws toward its end, the emotional temperature peaks without a clear release. No decisive moment arrives, only a sustained sense of friction. That friction is enough to satisfy an audience conditioned to equate tension with significance. But significance without resolution leaves an aftertaste of unease. People feel like something important happened, even if they cannot say exactly what. This unease is not accidental. It is the byproduct of a political culture that rewards implication over explanation. When implication dominates, clarity feels suspicious, and ambiguity feels profound. The exchange feeds that culture rather than challenging it. Both men are complicit, even if unintentionally. As the conversation moves forward, the ground is fully prepared for escalation. Expectations have been raised, patience has been thinned, and the audience is primed for confrontation. Whatever comes next will be interpreted through the lens already constructed here. That lens will determine who appears credible, who appears evasive, and who appears triumphant. And once that lens is set, it is extraordinarily difficult to change. By the time the exchange reaches this stage, something fundamental has shifted. Not in what is being said, but in what the audience believes the exchange is actually about. The discussion is no longer anchored to a specific policy question or procedural concern, but to a broader judgment about character and motive. Adam Schiff understands this instinctively because he has spent years operating in environments where perception can harden faster than facts. He begins to emphasize consistency, reminding the room that positions taken today align with positions taken long before the cameras arrived. Consistency, in political language, is meant to signal integrity. John Kennedy hears that appeal and quietly reframes it without ever naming it. He does not dispute the timeline or the record directly, because that would drag the exchange back into technical weeds. Instead, he questions whether consistency itself is proof of correctness or merely proof of persistence. It is a subtle pivot, but a powerful one, because it invites the audience to reconsider a virtue they usually take for granted. Suddenly, staying the course can sound like refusing to adapt. This is where the exchange becomes emotionally asymmetric in a more visible way. Schiff's responses grow more deliberate, measured not only for accuracy, but for how they might be interpreted later. Kennedy's questions grow more relaxed, almost conversational, as if he is confident that the momentum no longer requires effort. To some viewers, this looks like composure versus agitation. To others, it looks like evasion versus clarity. The same behavior supports opposite conclusions, depending on what the viewer already believes. The audience reaction, though mostly silent in the room, is loud outside of it. Social feeds begin to light up with clips framed as moments of exposure or moments of resilience. Context evaporates as quickly as it appears, replaced by captions that tell viewers what they are supposed to see. Schiff becomes, in some narratives, the embodiment of institutional overreach. Kennedy becomes, in other narratives, the embodiment of reckless simplification. Neither label fully captures reality, but both travel well. At this point, Schiff attempts to reclaim moral ground rather than rhetorical ground. He speaks about responsibility, about the weight of decisions made behind closed doors, about consequences that never make headlines because they never materialize. This is an appeal to seriousness, to the idea that some truths cannot be performed for an audience without doing harm. It is a defensible position, but it assumes an audience willing to defer. That assumption is increasingly fragile. Kennedy responds not by rejecting seriousness, but by questioning exclusivity. He implies, without stating outright that seriousness does not require secrecy and that accountability should not be conditional. This is where his style becomes most effective, because implication allows listeners to draw conclusions without feeling instructed. The audience feels like it is arriving at insight independently. That feeling is persuasive, regardless of whether the insight is complete. A subtle form of humor reappears, not in jokes, but in contrast. Kennedy's folksy phrasing sits awkwardly next to Schiff's formal diction, creating moments that feel almost absurd. The absurdity is not comic relief, it is tension relief. It allows viewers to exhale while still feeling engaged. Those moments often become the most replayed, not because they are the most informative, but because they feel human. Schiff's challenge here is that defending complexity in a compressed format can sound like deflection. Even when he is answering directly, the density of his language can feel like a barrier rather than a bridge. Kennedy's challenge is the opposite. By simplifying, he risks flattening issues that genuinely require nuance. Simplification feels empowering until its consequences become visible. The exchange now operates on two parallel levels. On one level, there is the literal conversation taking place in the room. On another level, there is a meta-conversation about who deserves trust in a system many people feel alienated from. That meta-conversation is where the real stakes lie. It is also where neither man has full control. This is where viewers begin to project their own experiences onto the exchange. Those who have felt dismissed by bureaucratic language hear Schiff and remember frustration. Those who have seen reckless rhetoric cause harm hear Kennedy and remember fear. The exchange becomes a proxy for lived experience rather than an evaluation of policy. That transformation is subtle but decisive. From a strategic perspective, Kennedy has achieved something important by this stage. He has shifted the burden of persuasion onto Schiff without ever explicitly demanding it. Schiff, meanwhile, has succeeded in maintaining composure and avoiding overt missteps. Both outcomes can coexist. Politics is not a zero-sum game in real time, even if it is framed that way afterward. What makes this moment particularly revealing is how little new information is actually being exchanged. Most of what is said could have been anticipated by anyone familiar with either man's record. The drama comes not from surprise, but from emphasis. Which points are repeated, which are brushed past, which are framed as obvious. Emphasis creates meaning where novelty is absent. The audience, sensing this, begins to look for something else. A crack, a slip, a moment where one of the men reveals more than intended. This anticipation feeds back into the exchange, raising the pressure further. Schiff becomes more guarded, Kennedy more patient. Each is responding not just to the other, but to the collective expectation in the room. As this phase draws toward its close, there is a sense that the exchange has reached saturation. The same themes are circling, the same tensions repeating. That repetition is not a failure, it is a signal. It signals that the real conflict has been fully surfaced, even if it remains unresolved. What remains is not to argue further, but to interpret what has already happened. By now, viewers are no longer asking who made the better point. They are asking who they would trust to wield power responsibly. That question is subjective, emotional, and deeply personal. It cannot be answered definitively in a hearing room, but it will shape how this exchange is remembered long after the microphones are turned off. By the final stretch, the exchange no longer needs escalation to feel consequential, because the audience has already decided that something meaningful has been revealed, even if it cannot be neatly summarized. The tension lingers not as anger, but as a quiet discomfort. The sense that competing versions of authority have been placed side by side without a clear winner. That discomfort is precisely what gives this moment its staying power. People rarely remember answers as vividly as they remember how an answer made them feel. And what this exchange leaves behind is uncertainty sharpened into judgment. Adam Schiff closes his participation with language that sounds intentionally measured, almost archival, as if he is speaking not only to the room, but to a future record. There is an implicit hope in that tone, the hope that time will validate seriousness and restraint. He does not chase the last word, because chasing it would contradict the very posture he has been defending. To his supporters, this reads as dignity under pressure. To critics, it reads as withdrawal at the moment confrontation felt most necessary. John Kennedy, by contrast, ends where he began, with curiosity that feels disarming precisely because it arrives so late. His final remarks do not sound triumphant, but neither do they sound resolved. They feel intentionally unfinished, as if he is handing the question back to the audience rather than closing it himself. That move is effective because unresolved questions travel farther than resolved ones. They invite debate rather than reflection, and debate keeps narratives alive. What follows is not applause in the room, but amplification outside of it. Clips circulate stripped of sequence, expressions frozen into symbols, pauses reframed as meaning. In some versions, Schiff appears embattled but principled, standing against a tide of suspicion. In others, Kennedy appears calm and incisive, exposing fragility without ever raising his voice. Each version feels complete to the people who want it to be. This divergence reveals the central truth of the exchange. It was never about changing minds in the moment. It was about reinforcing identities that already exist. Schiff speaks to those who believe stability requires expertise and guarded processes. Kennedy speaks to those who believe accountability requires disruption and plain language. Neither position disappears when the hearing ends. The questions that linger are not procedural, but moral. How much transparency is enough before it becomes recklessness? How much discretion is acceptable before it becomes insulation? Who decides where that line sits and on what authority? These are not questions a single exchange can answer, but they are questions this exchange forces into view. There is also an uncomfortable humor in the aftermath, the kind that surfaces only when tension has nowhere else to go. Commentators argue over tone as if it were evidence. Supporters on both sides accuse the other of seeing only what they want to see. Memes flatten complexity into punchlines, because punchlines are easier to share than ambiguity. The seriousness of the underlying issues coexists uneasily with the lightness of how they are consumed. From a broader perspective, this moment illustrates something larger about modern American political theater. Debate has become less about persuasion and more about positioning. Questions are crafted not to elicit information, but to elicit reactions. Answers are shaped not just for accuracy, but for survivability in a clipped ecosystem. The audience, knowingly or not, rewards the behaviors it claims to dislike. That does not mean the exchange is meaningless. On the contrary, its meaning lies in what it exposes about the system itself. It shows how difficult it has become to have a genuinely exploratory conversation in a performative space. It shows how easily seriousness can be reframed as arrogance and skepticism reframed as cynicism. It shows how trust, once fractured, cannot be repaired with rhetoric alone. As the cameras shut off and the room empties, the real impact begins elsewhere. Viewers replay moments that confirm their instincts. Writers build narratives that fit existing frames. Politicians study the exchange not for substance, but for technique. the cycle prepares itself to repeat. If there is a quiet lesson here, it is not about who asked better questions or who gave better answers. It is about how power now operates through perception rather than persuasion. Authority is no longer granted by position alone, nor is it dismantled by a single challenge. It is negotiated continuously in public, one clip at a time. That negotiation is exhausting, but it is also unavoidable. The audience, in the end, is left with a choice it cannot outsource. Not a choice between two men, but between two instincts. The instinct to trust systems that claim to protect us, and the instinct to question systems that ask for trust without explanation. Living with that tension may be the most honest outcome of all. So if you're asking who really won this exchange, the answer depends on what you were hoping to see. If you wanted certainty, you probably walked away frustrated. If you wanted validation, you probably found it somewhere in the noise. But if you wanted a glimpse into how modern political power is performed, defended, and challenged, then the answer is clearer. What you witnessed was not resolution, but exposure. And exposure has a way of reshaping everything that follows.